Hello and welcome to Strong Homes, Safe Families, the podcast of the Federal Alliance for Safe Homes. On this podcast, we explore building codes, construction, mitigation, building products, innovation, policy, and basically any topic that advances our movement for disaster safety and resilience. In other words, what we are talking about here is how to help people protect themselves and be safe and protect their homes when Mother Nature threatens. My name is Leslie Chapman Henderson, and I will be your host today. So for today's podcast, we're going to look back. It's been nearly 30 years since one of the most seminal events of our movement, and that is Category 5 Hurricane Andrew that struck South Florida on August 24th, 1992. It's been 30 years, and that storm and the events that followed have really changed how society looks at the built environment. It revolutionized how we respond to disasters, from insurance and emergency management, business resumption, and how families come back after these events. For us, as I mentioned, it kickstarted the disaster safety and resilience movement and inspired the creation of our organization by bringing together dozens of people and dozens of professionals who really committed to helping families and communities become resilient and bounce back more swiftly. We do have the perfect guest for this conversation today. He is someone who was there before and after Hurricane Andrew as a lifelong member of the greater Miami community and as a news professional whose job it was to tell the story about Hurricane Andrew before, during, and after. And along the way, lucky for us, he's also become a resilience champion and a great partner for us in our work to protect people and homes. He is former CNN Miami Bureau Chief John Zarrella, longstanding Flash partner, and even a guest host on occasion for this podcast. John, welcome to our podcast.
Thanks, Leslie. It's a pleasure to be here with you, as always. 30 years. Wow.
I know. So this is going to be a lot of fun because even in the getting ready for this and thinking back to the then and now, it has been 3 decades and so much has changed. But before we get started in our trek down memory lane, can you share with us a little bit about yourself and your professional background?
Yeah, sure. Well, I started in local television way back in the mid-1970s and then ended up in the early 80s at CNN and worked in Atlanta for a couple of years, then moved down to Miami as the bureau chief and correspondent. And I was there for another 30 years, so 32 years in all at CNN, covering just about anything in the Caribbean and in Latin America and, of course, the U.S. and hurricanes and lots of hurricanes. I think I covered just about every hurricane except a couple that hit the U.S. during that period. There were a couple that I missed, once because I was in Egypt and another time, I think Sandy. I didn't cover Hurricane Sandy, but all the others, and throw in some tropical storms along the way as well. So I was wet more often than I was dry, I think.
Well, and I think now our guests, our listeners can tell why you're the perfect person to talk about, what happened then and to kind of, benchmark how far we've come or not, and maybe even end on the note of what remains to be done. But before we do that again, let's talk about you and your family and your Hurricane Andrew experience as, having to deal with it both personally and professionally.
Well, let's say we weren't prepared for Andrew. Now, I hate to say that. You'd think I would have been, but in 92, we were not prepared. I remember my wife, Robin, going out and buying hurricane supplies on that Saturday and water and all that. Yeah, that Saturday. And the same day, along with the thousands of other people, we were out. We didn't have shutters at our house, so we were out buying plywood to put on the walls, on the windows. And the neighbor next door, who was an old building guy. He helped cut the plywood, fit it to the windows, and basically what we used to anchor them were concrete nails. So after the storm passed, you can imagine all the stucco damage that had to be repaired on the side of on the house along where the nails were in the windows. But there was a massive avocado tree in his property, and I was gone because I was covering the storm. My wife was telling me, and we lived in Broward County at the time, city of Plantation, South Broward, Middle Broward. And she was telling me that the avocados, because the tree was full in August, were just smashing against that piece of plywood. So we would have lost at least that one window if we hadn't at least had plywood on that. But so that was kind of our own personal story of Hurricane Andrew. But do you want to talk more about the actual event?
Yeah, so I wanted to so you were there already, but then you had to cover it, so you weren't at your home. I was living in Orlando, and I was working for the insurance industry for one of the major companies, and got the call and was deployed. At the time, I was getting my daughter, I remember I was sewing ribbons on ballet slippers, getting her ready to go into the first grade and her first ballet class. And I got the call to join the team and head south. And so it was a very eerie travel situation because they reverse laned the highways for the evacuation. And so as we were heading south the night before the storm, and we had some reporters with us as well that were kind of embedded, we set up shop in a hotel in South Palm Beach County. And honestly, that was probably the first dumb thing that we did, because we had no way of knowing where exactly Andrew would go. We didn't have the kind of meteorology skills and precision that we have today. So right then and there, I thought, what the heck are we doing? As we watched the storm wobble, we weren't sure where it was going to be, and we could have been right in there. So you weren't as ready as you would be today. We certainly weren't where we should have been today. So John, before we get into some of the events that unfolded, let's kind of set the table by talking for our listeners about how let's say the theater of operations looked back then 30 years ago. And let's talk about technology, or I guess we should say really the absence of some of the tools that we take for granted today. What jumps out to you? I have a couple things I remember thinking would have been pretty handy, but how about for you in the news side?
I've got so many, Leslie. It started off, we were in our offices in North Miami when the hurricane was blowing ashore. And the next morning, which would Monday morning, we were doing live outside of the offices in North Miami. So it was certainly windy and but obviously nothing like what was going on down in South Miami and in Homestead. So I remember we finally got on the road. We had to clear some trees from the parking lot to get the satellite truck out. We had to head down the turnpike into Miami. Well, as we're driving, I managed to get a call out, a cell phone call to the assignment desk in Atlanta. And I was explaining to them what I was seeing as we were heading further and further south towards Cutler Ridge area. And as I was describing the destruction that I was seeing even at that point, I remember pretty distinctly I was being told, there's no way it's that bad, John. There is no way it's that bad. And I'm like, yeah, it is. I'm here. I'm looking at it. And we weren't even in the worst of it. So we end up getting as far as Cutler Ridge, which is close South Miami area. Couldn't go any farther because all the overhead signage on the turnpike was down, blocking the road. We got off at Cutler Ridge, went into a shopping center, and it was being looted at the time right away. So our first aftermath experience with Andrew was looting of a toy store in Cutler Ridge, and then for the most of that day we didn't have any communications with Atlanta, very little. Because the satellite truck at the time,
the towers,
had cell phone service. Well, cell phones were down there at that point. So yeah, so we had one. We didn't have satellite phones back in those days, so you couldn't communicate through the satellite. Had to be through cell phones. So it was only by miracle, spotty, real spotty. Once in a blue moon, you might get a signal out to Atlanta to let them know what we were doing. So that was the course of that day. And then the president came down late that afternoon, flew in on Air Force One down to South Miami. And I believe it was that late Monday afternoon when he flew in. But bottom line was that then the next day, talking about technology, we went down to Naranja Lakes. We got a little further down. Naranja Lakes was basically blown apart. All these buildings were, like duplexes, and one was totally destroyed, 6 units, 8 units. The next one may not have even been touched. And then another one. And Bob Sheets, Hurricane Center director at the time, he and I did a tour later on, and he told me, he said, well, that was some sort of like downburst, microbursts, which are even more intense wind than in the normal circulation of the storm. So we had that. And then what we ended up doing was we found a really lovely woman who let us use her landline. And we ran telephone line from her house all the way out to the satellite truck. So that allowed us to have one line of communication to Atlanta for the producer to talk to the shows. They could tell him what they wanted me to do, but I had no communication. So I was live and he would have to cue me, but they couldn't, what we always see, them asking you questions and follow-ups. Couldn't do any of that because I had no way of hearing anything they were saying because we only had one landline phone that we borrowed from this lady. And of course, we could get a video signal out and audio because that we could go up on the satellite. But the only actual communication with what we called the pit, which was where the directors and the producers sat and the show producers, we didn't have anything but one phone to do that. So that was how it went down there for quite a while.
Yeah, I remember. So while you were doing all of that, we were advancing our catastrophe response team for the company I worked for. And our plan was to be headquartered at the Marriott in Cutler Ridge because we figured, well, we'll be inland, we'll be safe. Of course, as you know, that's exactly where the big hit was. So we were...
That was the Daytrans Center, right?
Dadeland,
All the windows got blown out.
Yep, right by Dadeland.
How do I remember that after 30 years?
I'm not sure. But I do remember the same kind of issues with communication, whereas today we would know immediately exactly where things hit and the level of damage, because of all the, drones. Just imagine the difference if we had drones. But what happened with us is we had to figure out a place to put our team as they were coming in from across the country. So we ended up on the water, on the bay, in the Biscayne Bay Marriott, along with the Florida Highway Patrol. And what was bizarre about that, as you remember, there was immediately a curfew. And every morning when the curfew lifted, the Highway Patrol would be heading out, and they had long guns because there were incidents.
There was looting. We saw it. Yeah.
And so they'd be heading out with long guns, and we'd be queued up in our little windbreakers with clipboards and fixie flat for the flat tires, which happened continuously, as you know. And it would take us... Because the first time I met you, we were down in Tent City. You'd take an hour to 2 hours to trek from the Marriott down to the kind of the ground zero. And one of the things that happened on the first day when we made it in, we went to Bell South had set up a phone bank. I think on the second day, and we got into the phone bank. I called our home office and I reported that we had seen Country Walk. Was the community, and this Country Walk suburb, everything was gone, as you recall, and they didn't believe us. So some of your video was going out to in the national news. They were seeing that the coast looked fine and everything else was okay. And I said, no, we're in a place, I think it's called Country Walk. And they said, well, what's the level of damage? And I said, all we see are slabs. There's no wood.
It's total.
It's gone.
Yeah.
The foundation is all that's left. And we did go through a period of severe communication impediments that are just not a problem anymore. Because
Well,
in some cases in recent years, I know that some of the insurers have been able to adjust claims, and the claims adjustment process took so long that you probably remember the cartoons in the Miami Herald. People, the most wanted person on in the whole area was the your insurance adjuster. And because
yeah.
we didn't have GIS, we had a very linear reporting system. So if you had been able to call us, and many people couldn't call anywhere, report your claim, it had to generate a claim. We had to go down to your house to see you. And if your next door neighbor happened to be insured with us, we had no way of helping them looking up their policy or doing anything. So it was a very clunky old way that fortunately is no longer, because today in California and Hurricane Maria and other instances, some of the companies have been able to entirely rely upon drones to do immediate assessment, immediate claims resolution. I mean, that piece of it, the then and now, in terms of how that aspect has been so improved. And I know it has affected, how you can cover the storms too. But I mean, we had fax machines, but the lines didn't work. The cell phones were as
No.
big as a brick or two, and they were, you had to reach for the sky to try to get it to work. And so it was just an impossibly difficult time. The thing I think about, not having been a Miami resident, is the signs were gone. And we picked up local employees and colleagues who didn't recognize their own neighborhoods because of the trees covering up everything. They got lost trying to get to their own houses. And so today we would be able to just pull up Apple Maps or Google Maps. But we probably spent as much time lost and driving around in circles as we did getting anywhere. And then with the curfew, by the time we got anything done, we had to start.
Well, those weren't isolated stories either.
Back.
That was happening all over South Dade and Homestead and all those places down there that people they didn't know the street, they couldn't pick it out. But we had from communications standpoint, we had the landlines, like I said, when you could find them. We before the storm, obviously we had NOAA radio. We listened to that. And during the storm, early stages, we would watch, obviously you watch all the local television stations, and we had a team at the Hurricane Center. So they could feed us information about what was going on, the storm's location, et cetera, landfall expectation, right up until we knew, through that communication that, it was more and more looking as if it wasn't going to be on the Miami-Dade Broward County line, which was the first, the initial thought that it had wobbled left and was going to go south. But, all that was basically from our team, at the Hurricane Center. So, but that was it. There wasn't really much else communication because cell phones were down and in 92, they weren't exactly as good as they are now either. So 30 years ago, it was pretty much the infancy.
And it was so hot. I remember, one of the things, so I worked with, and it wasn't your network, but a national network. We started getting, they would feed us the calls once we got back to the Marriott, and we would tell the different journalists that they would have to team up with us, and they couldn't be exclusive. So we'd have a little entourage embedded with us every time we go in because they wanted to talk to the families affected. And we'd go down there, and I remember telling a producer in New York, I said, now when you come, you have to be like a turtle, which is what we were always trained. You have to bring your own water, your own food. You have to be self-sufficient. There's not going to be any stopping at the convenience store to get ice. And he said, listen, we're war correspondents. We'll be fine. I said, okay. So on that particular day, and I could always tell you guys in the national, because you're always the ones that had the sound guy. I could always pick out the national crews because there's somebody dedicated to carrying a big boom.
Yep. Back in the day.
We got all the way down to the Keys, And people were standing in line and they were interviewing people in line. And because of the storm, there were no leaves on any trees. So there was no
No.
shade, no power. And that went on, as you know, that was the other big pursuit besides insurance adjusters, the utility workers. They were the most sought after people on the planet. But it
Yeah.
was really, really, really hot because those hurricanes will wipe out all that weather. And then you have these beautiful, sunny, blistering hot days in late August. And I noticed my friends for the day from that national outlet, the boom person was teetering in the heat. And I had been telling them all day, let's get some Gatorade, go hydrate, hydrate, hydrate. And down he went. And he had to
Yep.
leave because of heat stroke. There was a lot of, we always had used retired adjusters that would come back in, like the senior corps, to help when we had to expand the troops quickly to respond. And we sent most of our seniors back pretty quickly because the conditions were just unbearable.
Well,
They were
what we
unbearable.
ended up doing, was bringing a mobile home down there, and they put a mobile home in, brought a generator in, um, had a dedicated fuel truck, I believe, to bring us fuel for the generator, and so we had at least some semblance of a workspace, and we had set that up down on Campbell Drive in Homestead, which, as you recall, was the area where all was basically the tent city,
Yep.
where everybody that lost their homes were coming and sleeping on cots, and the
Yep.
National Guard and everybody, and American Red Cross, et cetera, were serving food and meals and water and all that. So that's where we were, and we had that set up for I couldn't tell you how long, but several months after the storm. I mean, every day there were stories out of there for at least 2 or 3 months.
Yeah, so we had different offices down there, different claims offices. And what happened, we had a series of really big hailstorms in Central Florida in the preceding March. And it prompted us to really think and drill and practice. And so we had this intrepid team leader who we used to this is bad, but I think we teased him because he was so really, he was a true believer that we were going to need to be as prepared as he wanted us to be. And of course, we were like, oh, come on, is it ever really going to be necessary to have our own electric setup and a commissary full of diapers and water and non-perishable foods? And he made us get ready, and he saved us because he had made an arrangement with a film company that if and when he had a standing rolling agreement, if and when this had ever happened, that they would divert all of their resources, generators, and everything to our team. And so we were the first ones that were up and running, and he had advanced, they had strategized out, okay, none of the employees can come to work if their kids are home. So we had on-site daycare, and supplies. We had preschool teachers prearranged. And frankly, it was this one gentleman. He was like our general. His name was Les Metcalf, and I haven't talked to him in years. I don't know what he's up to, but he is the reason that we were as ready as we were, despite it was a black swan event for us in the sense of thinking it would ever be that widespread and that bad
And
all at once.
and as you know, Leslie, it that was a very small hurricane.
Right.
I mean,
Compact.
Andrew was a very tiny, compact storm. The radius of hurricane force winds were only like 30 miles either side of the center. So once you got beyond that, like where we lived in Broward County, and even in North Miami, where we were when it first started,
yeah,
when it was coming through, we had wind gusts, but nothing other than trees down. And up where I was living in Broward County, the only damage were the downed avocados. I mean, quite literally. There was, that because of how compact that storm was, the quote, the old proverbial buzzsaw that went through.
Right. And
it could have been a whole heck of a lot worse.
It could have been. The thing I think that made it as intense as it was is that the population was so dense. where it did hit, but it could have been hit. It wasn't as dense as it would have been, to your point, if it had hit more in the metropolitan area. But the whole experience became almost otherworldly, and it was hard to
Yeah.
describe it to anyone that wasn't there. And one of the things we've dealt with in the following years is the people that lived where you live. Some people in Broward think that they did go through Hurricane Andrew. So
Oh, sure.
their definition of how life altering it was. I just remember the stories after story after story with my colleagues. It's like, how are you guys doing at home? And that this thing's like no power. And then what do you do with your dog and your animals and keeping them in the house when all your windows and sliding glass doors? It was a just completely disruptive time. But I think that some of the systems that were reinvented as a result, let's talk briefly about emergency management. The emergency management response system did not function well with Andrew. That was one of the big lessons learned. But out of that came the new system with the different emergency support functions organized. So instead of having a separate desk for the local law enforcement and the federal law enforcement over in a different place, all law enforcement on one desk, all meteorology on one desk, all Red Cross and those responders on one desk. So there was a lot more interagency, regardless of levels and all the red tape.
Sure.
That fix to the emergency management system has endured since then and is still the way that it's done today, and it is the ideal way, and there's even more evolution in that system. But that was one of the big problems then in the response, and it became big news stories too, unfortunately.
Well, yeah, you recall very well what you're talking about was that, the emergency management folks in Miami-Dade County, sadly, the only way they could get their message out was to hold, the held news. And of course, Miami, for the most part, was up and functioning fairly quickly, and they could hold their news conferences. And you remember the famous line from the then emergency manager, Kate Hale, send in the cavalry. We need the cavalry. But that was 2 or 3 days after the storm, when she made that remark. And it was only then that the airlift began of all the C-130s flying into Homestead Air Force Base at the time, and some of the other bases bringing in Opelika. I think they flew into Opelika. Maybe not. They might not have been able to get into Homestead because it was so damaged, but they flew into Opelika. But it was 4 days of people just and you're right. People that didn't experience it don't realize the absolute misery that the population down there, the hundreds of thousands of people that lived in that part of South Florida, were experiencing and going through when they had no roofs, they had no walls, they had no water, they had no food,
and they did not
and
know when
on
it
and
was
on
coming.
and on.
And you didn't. The interesting thing, and communication being really the whole thing. It was so difficult to know where to even go to get water and ice that they started flying airplane banners overhead. And
Yeah.
at one point, because our system was so linear with reporting, we decided to just pick zip codes. We mapped out the whole area and divided up all the zip codes, and we took buses and we went down with manual setups to just try to get it going. And the insurance response to Andrew got high marks initially because we were as innovative as we were. But unfortunately, the underpinnings of the insurance system, which I want to talk about a little bit, really kind of came apart because we realized that the assumptions for the industry that were built around expectations of building performance were very flawed. And very quickly, the issues with the building code became another of the big headline stories that you covered. I remember we talked about it many times. And, so some things that I think went since then that have really improved: meteorology, communication, right? We've seen advances now. We have, storm surge prediction coming out of the Hurricane Center, and it's just a different world. We have social media. at
Yeah.
Facebook Live, people can go down there and say, hey, I'm here, I need help. But the insurance system relied so heavily on assumptions of building sturdiness that were not well placed. And so that became a big part to this. And that's why we were created as a nonprofit 24 years ago, after we were really just a committee of people. And
Yeah.
to look at building codes. So do you remember there, in all these different things, there's always a hero and a voice that comes up. Do you remember the building code, Miami kind of raising the flag and saying, we need help here on the building code issue? It really changed the whole country. What are your memories regarding the issues around buildings? And, like you said, you didn't have shutters. It wasn't standard, and no one, would build a house now anywhere near you without shutters. Well, you're not exactly
Oh,
down there
absolutely
anymore.
not. Yeah. 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 No, I mean, it was back in the 90s, the early 90s. Again, it goes back to the fact that hadn't seen a hurricane in so many years. I remember growing up on Miami Beach and going through as a kid Hurricane Cleo in the 1960s and Hurricanes Donna and Betsy in the 1960s. That was it. After that, it was like, I can't think of another hurricane that came through South Florida, maybe missing something, but I don't think so, until Andrew. So, out of sight, out of mind. And so all of the construction that was done during that huge, long, decadal long period was shoddy construction. It was because you had this burgeoning population, and it was, throw up as quickly as you can, new housing developments like Country Walk, right?
And the
And
way you build, we got away from the way they build in the Caribbean with the more aerodynamic shaped hip roof versus these beautiful gable ends, which have no business. 3-story gable end wall homes have no business in Miami unless they're built as a continuous end, et cetera, or properly braced. And the building, every big event like this always has a building lessons learned. That was a big one. I remember doing probably 100 interviews about gable end walls and how they failed and how we
oh yeah,
prevent that the next time.
some
And
of those were with me.
yeah, yeah, and
Yeah.
how that translates into the building codes. So as I thought about this, and I think about all the we have drones now, we have satellites, we have satellite phones, you have mapping and GIS and precision. We have all these great things. The things our friends and the directors have done at the Hurricane Center, and the new satellites they have, and the technology and the software.
Didn't have it back in 1992.
None of it.
I can tell you, real quick anecdote to that. On the 17th of August in 1992, I went with my crew to the Hurricane Center to do a story on how there had been no tropical storms yet that year. On that day, when we went in there, Max Mayfield, Bob Sheets, the director, Max, and some of the other forecasters were looking at a blob in the Atlantic, and they named it that day. Andrew was named on the 17th. And of course, less than about a week later, and on the 20th, if you remember, and I remember the satellite photo was a grainy black and white image and that's what they had that they were looking at to determine that this was, indeed a tropical storm. But as I'm sure you recall, on the Thursday night, Friday, right before the storm, there was a huge debate at the Hurricane Center because Andrew was a mess. I mean, it looked like nothing. And they were about to downgrade it to a tropical depression. But Bob Sheets made the decision not to do it. He wanted to wait for one more cycle, one more run, one more look at whatever the hurricane hunters found. And it was because they didn't downgrade it. And then immediately when they got the new update 6 hours later, it started to become a whole different ballgame. So and look, you can see this, right? These are the bulletins. These are bulletins that I saved. You can't even read them, but for our listeners, they can't see them, but these were the bulletins that were issued on Saturday, the 22nd at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, when Andrew was now, after almost being downgraded the day before to a depression, was already at winds of 100 miles an hour. That's how fast it was ramping up.
And with that's first of all, that's an amazing story. And I guess I'd heard it before, but thanks for sharing it because I had forgotten that. Tell me this, could that happen today that way?
No, I don't believe it could. I mean, I don't think with the modeling that they have, the sophistication, the track forecasting, as you are so well aware of all of this, is spot on, really good. Intensity is an issue. We saw that with Michael in the Gulf a few years ago. All of a sudden, it's a Category 5 because you never know what the heck's going to happen in the Gulf.
Yeah.
But I don't believe that could happen because of the sophistication of the tools that they have at their disposal. They track these things from the minute they come off Africa. Not that they didn't then, but with so much more detail, the ability to know what to expect. And I don't believe now it's possible that you could still have had the unpredicted wobble, I guess, that Andrew had that took it south instead of on the Miami-Dade Broward line.
But we would know,
but probably
like right away. We'd know that it was
we
happening.
would know immediately that this was happening. We didn't then.
But I don't.
So I don't believe that you could have anything like Andrew, a surprise like that today.
I don't either. So what I want to do is I want to kind of take this next section and our last section and really talk about, I think there's a lot to celebrate. Like we said, the communication, the tools, the tech, just the systems, the speed of response, the emergency management, insurance, whatever the response pieces, the preparedness, and FEMA itself. Of just so many things are so tip top compared to back then. And then, of course, the meteorology. But the one, I call it the unfinished, and this rests on our shoulders, and this is what keeps me up at night, is the way that we build. And I want to acknowledge that we have a great, improved building, model building code creation system through the, since Andrew, the International Code Council, all these regional code bodies merged into this one entity. They have a consensus process. Every 3 years, we get a new model that takes in the innovation and the insights and the new products, as well as the post-disaster, those lessons learned. There's always something new. We always have a big takeaway headline in the building performance arena after a disaster, if fire, hurricane, etc. But we haven't yet created a system where we uniformly embrace those building codes, and the codes are minimum. They are not idealized, because we do have, the insurance industry has a beyond code standard that really to me is more code future, right? The fortified for safer living. That standard is not just minimum code, but it's idealized. And what often happens is the things in the beyond code end up in the minimum code over time. So it's like the leading edge of code development. But in Florida, to me, the unthinkable happened in 2017, and it was because of what you just said. We had gone 10 years in 2017 without any real significant landfalling hurricane to keep us mindful of the fact that we really need to pay attention to how we build. Because if we build right, avocado tree or no avocado tree, that house is still going to be there. And we have learned, and there is a ton of innovation in the engineering and science around how we build. But what we haven't continued to do yet, and what happened in Florida in 2017, is we abandoned, I say we, the Florida legislature, led by a builder and a roofer, unfortunately abandoned the system we embraced after Andrew. So we no longer have an on-time guarantee that Florida will take up the new model every 3 years and adopt it. Now it's we're going to take a look at it and we might adopt some of it, and that's what's happening. So now the building code is starting to fall behind in Florida. It's going to take years, but it's happening. We're leaving good things on the table. And I always liken it to like your cell phone. Can you really skip those iOS updates and expect your cell phone to not lock up at some point and stop working?
Well, Leslie, like you say, from the media perspective, it's similar. For the perspective that we have is it's only, and you know this as well as anybody, it's only after something terrible happens that people go, oh, wait a minute. What did we do wrong here? Why didn't we do this? And part of the problem I see is that it's like beating your head against the wall because the public still, general folks out there, haven't grasped it, haven't wrapped their arms around the fact that, we need to do this, this, and this. In fact, I can tell you people on this block here where I live are self-insured. They don't even have insurance on their properties. And that's the absolute truth. And during the last few storms that we had here, Matthew a few years back, then Irma coming up.
And you're further north now for our listeners.
And I'm further north up at the Space Coast.
Yeah.
People still put tape on their windows. We talk about what were the things that,
Yeah.
They still put tape on their windows. So no matter how much, that's why I say you beat your head against the wall a lot more than I do with these things. But the fact is that if the public doesn't embrace these changes, really embrace them and get behind it, it's a tough battle.
It is. And I like to make sure I always, it's a sandwich, right? We have made a ton of progress. We've abandoned things like stapling our roofs on. We don't do that anymore, at least not in the hurricane zones. There's so much that has been improved, but we're not there yet. And that's what I kind of want to just see if we can just leave this on, close this out with like, okay, what are we going to tackle together? I want to mention that the building code issue has been, over the last 30 years, we have the model codes that come out, but it is largely up to state and local government entities to take it or leave it, right? Some do, some don't. Some states, like my beloved Louisiana, they take up the statewide code, but then they take out the flood elevation requirement, which is nonsensical in the Bayou state. So, I'm not trying to pick on anybody here, but to your point, real people that aren't in this space with us, they have no idea. And so we're trying to change that. We ourselves have a building code transparency website, as you know, inspectorprotect.org. But one of the things that I think is promising, and what I want everyone here to know about, and we'll have it in the notes, is that our partners at the federal level have recognized that we cannot afford the $1 billion disaster chart that's coming out every year is going up, up, up. And so this has just become an unworkable situation. There is not enough money to wait around for these disasters and then pay for them. Never mind the human suffering and the recovery timeline. Some people never come back. So the FEMA has got a building code strategy. I was very honored to work on the creation of it. And it's not just a strategy. It has an implementation plan. There's a directive. And I think moving forward, and what I'm excited about as a grandmother, I want to retire someday and spend all my time with the kids, but I'm not going anywhere until this building code piece, how we build. Our organization was founded for this, has to change. So what we're going to start to see, and already are seeing, is linkage. And the state and local governments, they can do what they need to do or not do it. But if they want federal money, they have to look at having a building code. And the most recent or the next most recent, and the policies and the dollars. And I think this is what gives me hope, is that, it's the right thing to do all along. But for whatever reason, and maybe in many cases, they don't have enough money locally to administer a building code. But now that the dollars are hooked into those requirements, you can get more money before a disaster if you have a code in place. And so I think there's a prompt there that, we're not going to do another podcast in 30 years, but I think we're going to start to see, and we're already starting to see the silos come down around building codes. And we really need to talk to Florida, because if Michael had happened in 2016 instead of 2018, they would have never done what they did in the legislature. And that needs to be fixed and fast, because here we are. But I think there is hope on the built environment front. But we do need help from people like you and people in the news business to make it an everyday topic. And that is, that's tough stuff.
That's the challenge.
Yeah.
That is a challenge. Yeah.
I think my strategy, and we used to do this when I was in the insurance industries, we would take reporters, as I mentioned at the beginning, we'd embed you guys to show you and point, okay, that worked, that didn't work. And I think maybe we're at the point now, we just need to get real with why a house isn't there anymore and what related to how it was constructed happened to it. And we have to be honest about it. And I think at that point, the public will understand. We've done research, unfortunately, and our program's called No Code, No Confidence, but the American public is confident that their homes are built to the ideal standard, because they can't fathom that anyone would let you build them a house and not build it right. They think of it like their car. So that's what we're up against, and we need your help, and we need to continue to have your help to tell this story. And so I want everybody who's listening to this, who has a great idea for how John can take this story out there and continue his championing our cause of resilience. Our signature story that started with you, John, and that's the Tale of Two Homes. And that's still
And I was just going to say that. Yeah. You beat me to it. Yep.
Well,
because that's exactly what you said. We looked at one house on one side of the street that was blown apart, and the house on the other side of the street, what? A little bit of soffit damage, and that was it?
Yeah, a little bit of, I think the mulch was moved. There might have been one piece of a screen. But see, that's what I want to thank you for, because that is the story that really encapsulates the whole point of all this for us. I mean, we're thrilled with the advances in all the other elements to disaster safety and resilience, but we have unfinished business with how we build on a consistent basis. And it has to be everywhere, because there isn't any community that doesn't face some kind of threat. And so you captured and helped us capture the Tale of Two Homes. And that's really the point. So we want everyone to think about, where is my house going to be here when it happens, right?
And it's like you said, Leslie, it's the last thing that I have is that you think about it. We talked about the incredible advances in the technology, in the forecasting of storms, their intensity, the path, the track of the storm. All that stuff is great. But what good does it do you to know where it's going, how strong it's going to be if you're living in a house that isn't going to stand up to it? So it's wonderful that we have all this, that piece that you said. But then the other piece, the linchpin, we don't have.
Right. So we have work left to do. We have to keep at it and take care of our grandkids. And until we do, no retirement allowed. So it's all good. John, thank you so much for sharing those memories. It brings it back very vividly. And hopefully, as people realize we have made progress, but maybe they can help us. We want to encourage all of you guys to join us in our effort to get that last big piece of your word, linchpin, accomplished. I want to thank everybody for listening to this episode of Strong Homes, Safe Families. And if you have any questions or need information, contact us at info@flash.org, or you can even call us and try to stump our engineers with hard questions, toll free at 877-221-SAFE. That's 877-221-7233. If you like what you hear, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, share, and provide us a review on iTunes. So until next time, thank you for listening.